Hello, YouTubers. So I'm giving a talk this evening about 9/11, or rather the post 9/11 situation that we're all living in. And I think it's a talk that some people will feel is not relevant for different reasons, either because it's too divisive, and other than that, it's been such a long time. It happened in 2001. We're now in 2020. So 19 years ago, really. But I would still say it's historically of a relevant value. And go back to the first point, the fact that something's divisive or not doesn't mean you can't have a view on it. In fact, you may well do. My position was I really didn't know anything about it when it first happened. I was quite young at the time. I was studying A levels actually, and didn't watch TV, didn't read papers. I was too busy at the time studying. I was doing my A levels, working part time to pay for it, and going out and partying like students do. So I was too busy really, and I didn't really pay any attention to it. I was aware that it happened, just from other people that were sort of consuming the media at the time, and I suppose I was aware it was an awful thing and heard about it secondhand through them. I didn't read up much about it and didn't think a lot of it for many years, to be honest. So it wasn't something that deeply affected me in any level. I suppose, like anything, I took a passing interest at most, and I was just literally too busy with too much going on at that time, studying, working, and partying. and but Yeah, so they were happy days for me actually, to be honest, back then. But years later, I actually started looking into it more, and I came across lots of videos about it, lots of conspiracy theories about 9/11, and I got drawn into it, and whether there was some sort of problem with the story, the official narrative that's become the most common and or the most dominant sort of accepted theory over what happened. And there are so many other different theories abounding about it. I, some years ago now, watched some various videos about 9/11. I think it must have been 5 or 6 years ago when I first sort of started looking into it. I think just because I was looking into other things. I have a habit of looking into investigation documentaries anyway. So I'm always looking for other documentaries based on various investigations to look at, because I think they're worthwhile to study. And this one was certainly profoundly affecting many people, just because of the nature of what happened, of course. I think the fact that it was such an awful atrocity that occurred, so many people died, but coupled with the fact that it was witnessed as well. I think the second plane hit a tower while the news was still reporting it, and I suppose it was captured on TV, the actual tower falling, the towers falling. So I think the fact that many people witnessed it, affected them in a different sense, because it was something that they saw. It's different to if you read about a car crash. It's very different than if you actually witness it yourself. I think you feel it affects you more on an emotional level. But like I said, I wasn't watching anything back then. I was just too busy. Not that I wasn't interested, but I just didn't. And I suppose being young, I didn't really kind of think that it was anything to do with me either. I really didn't see that it affected me personally. But as I watched these videos making various claims about different theories of what might have happened, and actually portraying many supposed inconsistencies with the much more dominant narrative, I sort of realised that it does have an effect. It affects lots of other people. There were people that signed up to go to the war in Afghanistan, which of course followed 9/11 directly, and that was the justification for that war. In fact, for soldiers going to serve their country, that policy had a very real impact for them. Of course, they believed that it was Islamic extremists and the Taliban responsible, and that was the justification, I think, for going into Afghanistan, wasn't it? To root out extremists of Islam or political terrorists. And so that there was a sort of a rationale behind that. There's a ripple effect. It affects people that went up, active servicemen and women. But also, I think it's affected other people in another sense of how they view the world as well. And I think that's much more profound. It's something that's still referred to now. And it casts a shadow, really, over many subsequent years of foreign policy. And also it's coloured sort of how we view the world as well. And what's strange is that, if the conspiracy theories are true, that what it means is that the mainstream media, if you call them that, all the different the news outlets, from the BBC to CNN, ITV, the newspapers as well, they're all reporting more or less the same kind of story, that it was these 19 hijackers that took over 2 planes, or 3 planes, in fact. They crashed them into the 2 towers, and there was a 4th plane, in fact. I think 1 plane went down somewhere else, and the 4th, I think, went into the Pentagon. And that's the official story. And I think that is believed by many people. I think it's had a very divisive effect on public opinion, actually, and I think that remains to this day, in fact. And I think there are a large segment of the population that accept that that is what happened, that those 19 hijackers were part of extremist Islamic terrorist group who were anti-American and anti-the West, and that they destroyed the towers and killed all those people for some misplaced vengeance or some sort of extremist anger, some sort of, that they thought they were doing God's work, carrying out the wrath of God or something. And I think a lot of people, there are a large amount of people that accept that as the story. But I think there are a growing number of people over the years, over the 18, 19 years now, that have come to believe an alternative theory. That is that it was an inside job, or that there were various others that were to blame, and that it wasn't actually an extremist Muslim group from Afghanistan. It wasn't anything to do with Osama bin Laden or the Taliban or anyone. And I think there were probably much larger proportion of people globally, from a global perspective, who don't really have any strong belief on it one way or the other. And in fact, that's pretty much how I was for a decade or so. Didn't have any view on it, didn't see that it affected me at all. And I didn't study it, didn't take the time to look at the facts. I didn't either see the mainstream narrative or the alternative one. I didn't look at either, really. Too busy with too many other things going on at the time, didn't see it as relevant, and so didn't have a particularly strong view on it one way or the other, really. And I think that probably is a majority view globally, and I think there's probably lots of people in lots of countries in the world that it probably doesn't directly affect them personally, so it's not something that they need to go out of their way to research or look into, really. And I suppose if you're living in a remote village in Africa or in a mountain in Nepal, it may not be something that relevant. And for many people, why should it be? Just as an awful tragedy that occurs, in a part of the world far, far away from me, and I'm never going to meet any of the victims, it's of little kind of relevance to my life, probably. But I think for me, it became something more important to look at, because it did seem to have a big impact on how people view the world. I think the war on terror and all its subsequent policies that stemmed from that, and also in terms of how the public view Islamic extremists in general, American foreign policy in general as well, and how we view investigations as well, in terms of how we also view the media, So it has a relevance in a number of different issues. So I kind of viewed that it did have some relevance. So it was a worthwhile subject, therefore, I thought, to sort of look into further. And I have to say, after sort of trawling through various websites and videos making claims and counterclaims, and sort of like it was an awful kind of trial to look through it all, and I really didn't want to actually. But at the same time, I felt a duty bound thing, that it was necessary to sort of look at it and to decide for myself, and to weigh up the evidence and to see what I thought was credible and what seemed most realistic. And for a number of reasons I'll go into in a moment, I actually don't accept the mainstream story. I don't accept that it was a hijackers that took over planes and crashed down the towers. I think that when I've scrutinised and looked at the evidence, I see that as an implausible kind of story. And there are a number of reasons for that. And I think if you've taken time to look at it, you may come to the same conclusions. But I'd be quite interested to know why other people don't come to the same conclusions as I do, because it seems, to me at least, if you look at the evidence, it seems fairly conclusive. So there's very little doubt in my mind. But I think before I just accepted the version of events because that's the only story that I knew. It was probably the most prominent one at that time. I occasionally read The Guardian at university. I still read some sections of it now, and I sometimes would listen to the radio back then. So I suppose it was the only kind of information that I was getting at the time. I didn't have the internet. I certainly didn't have access to other videos and other stories about it back then. So it seemed kind of normal and natural for me to accept it then, but I hadn't looked closely upon the evidence at it either. I hadn't seen any need to be honest, actually. So why do I come to that conclusion? How have I come to that thought? Why was that? I suppose one of the most compelling reasons for me, for what makes me doubt the official storyline, is first of all the way in which the towers fell. And I hadn't really thought about it until I sort of closely examined it, and it was pointed out to me. The way that they fell is absolutely unique, and anyone that's ever witnessed or seen demolition will testify to that. That there's a certain way demolished buildings will fall vertically like this, because that's the nature of the dynamites within it that causes it to have a vertical collapse like that. Rather than if a plane hits into something, it might just collapse like all over the place. But in fact, when these towers were constructed, they were reinforced with the strongest kind of steel within its structure. So that made it extremely strong. And there were other towers equally as strong as the Twin Towers that have withstood just as big an impact as that, and they didn't vertically collapse in that manner. And it was the way that they collapsed so suddenly, so swiftly, that points closer towards a demolition job as being much more credible. It looks more similar. If you've watched videos, and I did, of various demolitions, it looks identical to those, in fact. The other point, of course, is Building 7, the anomaly of how that collapsed, also in a vertical collapse, swiftly. And that wasn't even hit by any aeroplanes or anything. So that does seem bizarre that would in fact collapse. There's no real logistical explanation behind that. The only possibility is that it was a demolition job. And that's, there's no real way that would have collapsed when you stop to think about it. And there were many architects, who I read the accounts of, who came to that same conclusion, for that reason. That it just seemed just implausible how a building could fall like that. And it's only when I actually stopped to think about it, the illogicity of it, the irrationality of it, in fact, that just seemed like too incredible to believe that, really. A reinforced steel building built to withstand. And in fact, there had been a fire beforehand, in fact, many years earlier, there was a terrorist attack on the same buildings, and it withstood, the damage there was repaired. And if you look at other buildings, like I said, that have also withstood similar impacts and damage, they didn't collapse in that same manner. I think one of the first things I heard that first made me think this sounds just ridiculous, too incredible to be true, really, was the how they identified some of the alleged hijackers, where they were reported to have found intact passports from the actual hijackers that had been allegedly scattered from the debris of the crashed planes. And when you actually stop to think about that, it's just baffling, isn't it? Like a passport inside a coat on a hijacker in a plane that goes inside a building that then blows up. How does that passport end up being intact and legible and found on a city street of New York to identify a hijacker? Is that possible? I mean, can anybody give that any kind of credibility? That sounds like the most absurd idea to me. But in any case, I'm not laughing at what happened. I'm just finding that is bizarre that anyone could actually think. I didn't know at the time that was one of the claims being made about it. But it does seem ridiculous. And there are a number of other anomalies too. The reported calls on the plane. Most people that have flown in a plane will know that if you try and use your mobile phone, you can't get any reception up there. So how were people able to make telephone calls home before a plane crashed? Or before, I don't know, because I have read that that's been disputed because there allegedly were some telephones on the plane that might have better reception. So I don't know about the technological abilities at that time. So, I'm not really sure about that. And moving on to the third point, in any case, there was a site where one of the planes was allegedly brought down. And every now and again, you will have a plane that crashes somewhere, and people will go out to collect the various pieces of that. They collect the debris of it. And this particular plane, not a single piece. They found nothing. It just vanished, it disintegrated virtually. It's just, just another thing, just too incredible, really. I just like, when you have a plane crash, the debris tends to be scattered over a certain region. And it gets broken up into small fractions, small bits. But you will find fragments of it. Just the lack of things that were found in the alleged plane crash site. Just says that there wasn't a plane crash in that area at all, actually. If you look at something very odd about the Pentagon, there's no CCTV footage of the plane actually crashing into the building. You would think of all buildings that would be the most safe and secure place, covered with 24/7 surveillance and with the best, high-tech surveillance. You would expect there to be, a high-quality HD camera focused on all angles of that building. And yet you don't see that. There's no footage of the plane actually going in and the impact of it striking the building. You look at the whole of the actual building where the plane's meant to have crashed through. It doesn't look anything like the whole a plane you would imagine making. It doesn't look big enough, for starters. There's nowhere the wingspan might be. It doesn't seem to have that collateral damage, that impact that you might expect it to have. Nothing of the sort, to be honest. And you would expect that if they had known about the first plane crash, you would expect them to have some tracking awareness, wouldn't you? With all the sophisticated technology that they do have. And so it's almost like the dog that didn't bark, really, as well. It seems just too odd, really, to me. That, you've got the first plane that hits and that. Well, how could a plane have diverted away from where its natural course would have been? air traffic controllers, they monitor all planes, and they would be aware straight away once a plane ventures off its set course. So it does make you then wonder, why weren't military aircraft scrambled at that point? Why weren't they why didn't they take down the plane before it hit the Pentagon, before it come into their territory? They must have had monitoring equipment and had an awareness that it was there. So that does seem odd, doesn't it? Really. So there are a striking number of anomalies really about it, and I think for me, I think it is really the way in which the actual towers collapsed themselves. I think that's sort of like enough really, and Building 7, which collapsed without any plane hitting it whatsoever. Even if you're told otherwise by alleged experts, there are experts that say one thing and experts that say the opposite. But I suppose you've got to make up your own mind what you think is reasonable and what you think is most likely. I've come to my own conclusions, and I guess others must come to theirs. And I suppose I didn't really have any doubts beforehand, simply because I hadn't looked at the information that clearly, I suppose. Hadn't seen any reason to. So how does it... there are other reasons. There are other things that make me doubt the whole case as well, in fact. It's not limited just to those few points. But I think that for me, those are the most important of the points, really. And I think, there are certainly many other things as well. But I don't want to go into all the other points, because some of them I think are much more disputable, but I think those are the less hard ones to dispute, actually, really. I think it's a bit more clear cut, really. And I kind of think, so is it, what actually is the effect of this? Is it still relevant? And I would say yes. And the effect has been that public opinion has been very divided over this. Families divided against families, colleagues against colleagues. People have got very different views on this. People that are good friends with each other. People that may agree on a wealth of other subjects, but feel very divided on this, So, you have to still get along with people and respect their right to have a different verdict, a different sort of conclusion to your own, of course, and that does often happen. People will look at the same evidence, even in juries, people will look at that evidence and often come to different conclusions. Sometimes you bring your own life experiences, and we all have our own inherent biases too. So we do have to strive to get along with people, don't we, with different beliefs. We don't have to agree on everything. But, we're bound to come into contact with people who will hold different views to us, increasingly, because there are large amounts of people in both camps who have very different views and that. And what the outcomes, for me, I suppose, I felt really, to have got this wrong. I think so many media outlets, I think it's that they probably haven't looked at the information and the evidence sufficiently enough. I remember I've been told things and I pass it on to other people, because I haven't stopped to critically think about what I'm saying and whether it actually stands up to reason and is credible or not. And I've been told various news stories. I pass it on and tell someone else. So I've been part of that sort of connection of just passing on information uncritically as well. And so I don't hold any people in judgment. I don't think, oh, how awful of anyone. I think it's something that we all do sometimes. But it does kind of make me think how a story can become so widespread and so accepted by so many people. And accepted as a true version of events, without necessarily being credible, without necessarily being examined closely and scrutinized to check up and see whether or not it actually does stand up to proper scrutiny or not. And how far that can go, the extent to which that can go as well. When you look at, the number of news outlets that still to this day do report that same official narrative, that it was the Taliban, Osama bin Laden, that it was these political Islamic extremists in Afghanistan, when the evidence itself on closer inspection doesn't point to that at all, actually. It points to a planned demolition, because that's how the towers fell. That's how Building 7 fell. That's the only conceivable way, in my mind, that it can happen, and in millions and millions of other people's minds too. Many of us have come to that conclusion, and I would wonder if many other people haven't come to that conclusion only because, like I was going through, they haven't, A, looked at the information closely enough, and B, the only real credible story that they've been given so far is that it was hijackers on a plane. So therefore, if you're only given one story and you don't really see there's anything more to look into, naturally you will accept that, and that's where I did, I suppose, for those years, and didn't see any relevance in looking deeper into it, really. But I think it is relevant, and what it's and I think for me, and I'm guessing, I suppose, for many other people that have come to the same conclusion as me, I suppose for us, we now have become more skeptical before accepting anything as true. We maybe have a tendency now to sort of scrutinize things more, not just in news outlets, but in any information source, wherever it's coming from, whoever. We're now probably got a tendency more to look closer at something. And I think there is a danger that it could lead to being too skeptical and saying, oh, we're not going to accept anything unless we can absolutely be sure that it's proven beyond any doubts. But I think it's more credible that I myself have come to an agnostic sort of position. And I think that's probably a lot more acceptable to me to say, okay, well, if I don't know and I haven't got the evidence before it, I don't know. And, if I've got the time and it's necessary and I feel like I should, then I'll look into it and I'll see whether there's enough evidence to come to some sort of conclusion. And so I think, was I too naive before? And I think I am still naive in many things, yes. It's a human struggle that we've all had, that tension between not wanting to be too cynical, not wanting to be too naive, and you find that in everything in all your life, don't you, really? I remember when I was in the psychiatric ward, I especially had it then, you'd be hearing some story about someone who's been through some alleged abuse and something awful. Then you meet the alleged abuser from their family who tells quite a different story, and you're in a head spin and you think, I don't know whose account to believe here. I naively accepted what this patient had told me just because they seemed quite upset and it seemed quite believable at the time. And so it's quite hard to know, isn't it? And especially when it is a very emotional situation like that. Something like 9/11 is like a lot of other investigation documentaries, it's easy for me to, and for many others, to talk about it more objectively because we're not so emotionally invested in that. If it's something that you're much more connected with, you're emotionally invested, that's different. If you had a family member that died in a certain situation, you have got some closer interest in that, of course. And it's going to be much harder to come into conflicts or to meet other beliefs that are going to contradict views that you hold quite closely. You may have held those views for years, decades perhaps even, so you've invested a lot of time into that. So that is harder. And I think personal investigations, are bound to be much more emotionally draining in that. It's that hard tension, isn't it, between not being too emotional and where you're sort of like, you're driven by your anger about someone or by your depression and your upset. But at the same time, you don't want to sort of divorce yourself completely from having any emotions. When you watch a program or a documentary, they're not a character in a story or something. They're real people with real problems, aren't they? And like we all are. And so, and we all kind of like need to remember that, you know. So I don't know. I got a thing where I try not to be too naive. I don't want to read everything and sort of believe everything's fake and everything's false these days. But at the same time, I don't want to be naive and just believe anything. And I think as well, all the more important, like if you are doing something based on that evidence. Someone says to me, "Oh, so and so down the road's really done something awful to me," and I say, "Well, I'm going to go and have a word with so and so," and sort of like confront him and find out what he's all about. And but I need to be careful when I go and meet so and so that actually I make sure the claims about him are true, and I don't just storm around there, beat him to a pulp, only to find out later that he wasn't actually the one that did that at all. So, and I've had many occasions like that in my life where someone has said something alleging about someone. I go around there and I hear a completely different side of the story when I go around there. And often the story is somewhere in the middle, I find. Sometimes it's not, and somebody is absolutely lying about something. And, that's as old as time, isn't it, really? There have been people for generations, centuries, millenniums that have, made up awful lies about other people. And, I suppose we live in a world where there's much truth and much deception, and we have to be cautious who we trust and how we evidence things and how and what we accept and why we accept it too. And I think we must be extremely cautious before we go off and act upon something intelligence. We must be cautious about accepting how credible that is. How well do we know that person that's telling us that? What motive could they have in telling us this? Why would they be saying that? And I wouldn't want people to become totally cynical and trust no one, never. And that would be it's a hard world to live in, isn't it? Really, but at the same time, we also don't want to be too naive where we trust everyone and everything that anyone says all the time. We will just be totally vulnerable and played if we allow that. And at the same time, when it's extremely important and we are taking our life and other people's into hand, we need to be all the more cautious about examining things carefully before acting on it.